as you know, we've been going through Ephesians, and now Paul is setting us up for the last big kind of conclusion, and we've been walking through. Ephesians is such an interesting book because the first 3 chapters are kind of about all what God has done for us, and the last 3 chapters about how he's recreating us into being new humans. And the 2 sentences we have today are challenging, difficult, maybe even disturbing. But I want to review what we've done in Ephesians so far. So the outline that I think of is this outline on the screen you can see. So Paul starts off what God has done for us, which is basically everything. And then he tells us what's required of us. And I love it. There's a one sentence in Ephesians 1 where it says, to be in worship. And so one of my friends says that's why we're called human or beings and not doings, because it's about being in worship. And then he goes into what God desires for us, and it's all about becoming like Christ. And so there's a whole section of us being transformed to be more Christ-like. And then he goes and into a whole section of what we've been walking through these last few weeks of what that change looks like. Internal character, external behaviors. Pastor Jeff has been talking about relationships for the last several weeks, and now we get into circumstances. Difficult relationships and difficult circumstances. And so this next slide is one of my favorite slides. I love Calvin and Hobbes. And to me, this is Ephesians. God's consistently shooting at our head and our heart, trying to change both of them. And always go for the head and the heart, right? That's the deal. So let's just read the passage that we have for today. So it's Ephesians 6, 5 through 8, and it's up on the screen. I'll read it. You can just follow along. It's slave, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling, with a sincere heart as you would Christ, not by way of eye service as people pleasers, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, rendering service with good will as to the Lord and not to man, knowing that whatever good anyone does, this will be received back from the Lord, whether he is a slave or is free. So that's the first sentence. Paul would not have passed my grammar class in high school, that's for sure. Now let's go to the second sentence. Masters, do the same to them and stop your threatening, knowing that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and there is no partiality with him. 2 very difficult sentences, first one especially. So the first word, and I read it as slave because that is actually the translation. It's often translated, as you saw there, bondservant, or sometimes they just say servant, but slave is the actual word, and slavery is a very difficult topic to talk about. In fact, when I started preparing for this, when Jeff was originally going to be out of town, I looked it up. There was over 180 verses in the Bible that use the word slave, 120 plus in the New Testament alone. So it shows up a lot. And what I didn't want to do is kind of gloss over it, and yet I didn't want to take it out of context either. This is a really tough topic. And so what the translators are trying to do here is they're trying to give us a sense that first century slavery was different than what we have in our mind as American slavery. And I think that's really important, and I think it's good for us to kind of put it into that context. But it was still slavery, right? So the first thing I want to do before we jump into, kind of dissecting the chapter is just give a little context about slavery. And I think we need to acknowledge that from our country's founding, there was a battle raging about slavery and the abolition of slavery. I started reading a bunch of books, and I started listening to a book on Lincoln and all kinds of stuff. And it really was pretty eye-opening. And sadly, Christian leaders and pastors use that first sentence that we just read as a way to justify slavery. In fact, they said slavery was a God-ordained institution. And likewise, there were pastors at the same time and Christian leaders who used virtually the rest of the Bible to say, no, that's not right. Slavery is not God ordained. That it's a situation where humans do this to each other, but it's not God ordained, and it was evil and a great injustice. And so I just want to kind of put that in context, that in some ways, a lot of historians call slavery America's original sin. And there's a lot of truth to that. And so it's a topic we hardly ever talk about. It's a topic that we kind of ignore in the Bible. So we're going to talk about it. So slavery has existed in every culture throughout history, basically. It still exists today, but slavery doesn't always look the same. And slavery can take many forms. People can feel enslaved, even if they're not. So to wrestle with the Apostle Paul saying here, we need to understand slavery in his context in the first century. So slavery in the first century was different, as you can see up on the screen. It was still slavery, but it was interesting in that in the Roman Empire, when it kind of at the height of the Roman Empire, slaves were about 2/3 of the population. If you can imagine that, 2/3 of the population. At the time this epistle was written by Paul, it was probably about 1/3 of the population of Ephesus. Interesting, right? But slavery in the first century was not like slavery in America. It was not race-based. It was generally not forced, although it was sometimes forced if there was a conquest. That was kind of earlier in the Roman Empire. And it was a situation where a slave could buy their way out of slavery. There were rules. Slaves could even own other slaves. It was a really interesting and different situation. In America, it was race-based. It was cruel. It was inhumane. And so it was very different. And so I do think the translators are trying to help us understand how to put this into context. But let's be real. It was still slavery. They weren't free. So I just want to ask you a question. So you're the Apostle Paul, and you're writing to a church in Ephesus where 1/3 of the members of that church are slaves. What would you say to them? Interesting question, right? Would you say, run away? Would you say strike? would you say something else? And yet Paul says, slaves, obey your masters. Why would he say that? Or maybe a better question for us, trying to apply this to us, is what would Paul say to us if 1/3 of our members needed to work 2 to 3 jobs in order to just get by? What would he say to us? It's a really important question. We know from Paul's other letters, that he encourages slaves to become free as soon as they possibly could. And on another case, he instructed a runaway slave, Onesimus, to go back to his master, Philemon, but he encouraged Philemon to be gracious to him. It's a great little book if you've never read Philemon. So it's a tough question, right? Why? Why would this be in the Bible? And I think the answer is what Paul's telling us is that when we're in difficult situations, sometimes it may be that our Christ-like mindset and behaviors that we've been going through in Ephesians are the most powerful witness of all. That it's in those difficult situations that sometimes people can see the truth of God's love in a completely different way. Now, I think of this and I think of, so what would it be an example of this? And I come to Philippians 2, and I'm going to read that for you. This is probably one of my favorite verses in the whole Bible. Have this mind among yourself, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of servant, actually it's slave, being born in the likeness of men, and being found in human form, he humbled himself to become obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. right? Interesting. I mean, God takes the form of a slave on our behalf. Patient obedience, humility, emptying ourselves of our pride, even sometimes our rights, is a powerful witness. That said, there's a difference between being in a difficult situation and being in a harmful situation. God does not want us in a harmful situation. Paul wasn't writing to people who were necessarily in a harmful situation. I think Paul's advice to somebody in a harmful situation would be completely different. So I think we just have to see this as Paul speaking directly to people in difficult situations and saying, just like we've seen in relationships and just like we've seen in behaviors and just like we've seen in our internal character, Paul's saying, be Christ-like in that situation. So last week, I was reading the Wall Street Journal. Many of you know I ran a big company, and so I still read the Wall Street Journal, and this headline showed up, and it said, St. Bernard on the Hertz bus. And I have to tell you that my first reaction was not very charitable. My first reaction was, oh my gosh, somebody's bringing a St. Bernard onto the plane as a comfort dog. and I thought, I have to read this, because it's just like one of those things. So I started to read it, and then I quickly figured out that I had the wrong St. Bernard. So let me read the article to you, because I think it's worth just thinking about this. So this is the article. I recently returned from a vacation in Boulder, Colorado. On the drive to the Denver airport, my mind was churning over many things to be done back at work, sensitive issues, and uppishly, I felt like I alone could handle them all. Then I met Dave. Dave Moeller drove the shuttle bus that carried me from the Hertz rental car lot to the terminal. I might not have noticed him, except the whimsical song he was playing, A Groovy Kind of Love by the Mindbenders, broke my news feed's gravitational pull. Looking up from my iPhone was my good fortune. It allowed me to see a festive bunting reading, Cheers to 45, that adorned the bus cabin. Mr. Moeller had driven the airport shuttle for Hertz for 45 years, a fact that he shared with pride moments later over the public address system. The announcement drew applause. Humorous observation of a man comfortable with his place in the cosmos followed, making the journey pleasant. Based on how swiftly he moved the luggage from the bus to the curb, Mr. Moeller appeared to be as light of foot as he was of heart. As the shuttle pulled away, a thought occurred to me. Mr. Moeller had performed that morning's repetitive tasks multiple times a day for more than 4 decades, yet still he did them with the purposefulness and lightheartedness of an applicant looking to land the job. The admirable marriage of consistency and mirth got me thinking about the bus driver's job and the one which I was returning to. All things being equal, work done joylessly is work done less efficiently, for nothing ever happens in a vacuum. Someone is always watching, whether it's at the office, a colleague, or a bus passenger, and are influenced accordingly. This means that whatever a person's vocation in life happens to be, what they do isn't nearly as important as how they do it. This is so especially after considering a timeless self-inquiry attributed to Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, quid equal aeternam, which is, what does it matter in the light of eternity? Isn't that a great saying? And for those of you who don't, I had to look up St. Bernard, didn't know anything about St. Bernard. He apparently said that all the time because he lived in very difficult circumstances. And so they would hear him mumbling that all the time. And it became kind of known for him because he was somebody who had difficult circumstances, but just kept saying, in the light of eternity, what's this? Asking this question frequently of oneself reminds us that all earthly tasks, from bus driving to being a lawyer, are comparatively small, and all that matters in the end is the love in which we do them. Deep in my bones, Mr. Moeller seems to have understood this. Perhaps this is why he's staying the same happy bus driver in that wonderful seat for 45 years. Isn't that a great great little story. So the person that wrote that was a lawyer from Charlotte, North Carolina, whose simple little bus ride changed from one interaction, changed his whole perspective. And interestingly, being a bus driver is not one of the more glamorous jobs in the world, but it changed that person's life. And it actually reminded me of another story that I read 10 years ago that I have had, once I read that story popped into my mind. I've thought about it periodically. And search engines are wonderful things because it only took me about 10 minutes to find this story. I'm not going to read the whole article to you, but it was a story of a bus driver in San Francisco. And it was from the 2013 San Francisco Chronicle. And the story was about a lady named Linda Wilson Allen. And I'm just going to read you a little excerpt from this. She said, the Chronicle describes Linda as someone who loves the people on the bus, knows the regulars, learns their names. She'll wait for them if they're late. She'll then make up time on her route. She would go out of the driver's seat to help seniors. One day, Linda even reached out to a passenger who was lost and afraid and invited them to join the family Thanksgiving dinner. Her kindness has touched people so powerfully that some passengers will let another bus go by just so that they can ride with Linda. She said her job can be thankless and filled with frustration from cranky passengers to traffic jams and breakdowns, so she begins each day with prayer. At the crack of dawn, she asks God for guidance on how God might help her bless the people that she encounters on her route. She asks God to help her shine light into dark places. Isn't that a great, it's just such a great story. And the reason I bring these two bus driver stories up is because they illustrate, I think, what Paul tells us next perfectly. And it's how we serve in difficult situations. So if we're in a difficult situation, we need to have the mind of Christ. How do we serve in that difficult situation? And so we read on, it says, slave, obey your masters with fear and trembling and with sincere hearts as you would Christ. What does that mean? Well, fear and trembling is actually an idiom. It'd be like the English phrase, sick and tired. It doesn't mean you're like physically sick or exhausted. What it means is you're just frustrated with the situation or something like that. So this idiom of with fear and trembling would maybe be best described as with reverence or with great respect. So if you think about it, serve with great respect. And we read on, not by way of eye service as people pleasers, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, rendering service with goodwill as to the Lord and not to man. So you start getting what Paul's getting at here. Paul uses such great language: people pleasers, eye service. I think one translation helped me understand this better. Obey them not only to win their favor when their eyes are on you, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart. So it's just like, don't just do it when they're looking. Do it because you want to do it, right? And we think of that kind of service. And so let's finish up on this advice to slaves in these difficult circumstances and how we serve, knowing that whatever good anyone does, this he will receive back from the Lord, whether he is slave or free. So again, back to St. Bernard, it's like in the scheme of things, God has this. We have to think about the circumstance. So an important question for us as Christians is, does our lifestyle, does our service matter this side of the new heaven and the new earth? And Paul's saying it does. It may not be about us. It may be about all those people around us. So I grew up Lutheran, and we most of the messages were very focused on salvation through grace by faith and faith alone, right? And that sometimes we missed out on this invitation of studying and following Christ, like we're going to read in the John Mark Comer book, and the whole practicing the way into a full life, and how that helps to change us. And Paul reminds us in these last 3 chapters of Ephesians that grace and good works are not in opposition. They're not different things. That we are created for good works. And could it be that it's as simple as the way we show up in difficult situations and difficult service is the way in which God can change us and change all the people around us? And isn't that the good work? Isn't that great? And it even says that God gives us rewards. So what kind of rewards? Well, I was, as many of you know, I was a CEO of a big company, and I would always get asked all the time about, leadership and how I got to this job and blah, blah, blah. And one summer, we always had these summer internships for mainly inner city kids that, and instead of just putting them in, in kind of some of the lower level jobs, we would have them shadow, somebody in one of the kind of, whether it's our investment area or, some fairly sophisticated part of the company. And they would shadow that person for a couple weeks, and then we would move them around. And at the end, they would always come up to my office, and we would kind of just introduce them to me, and we'd always just talk about their service and what they learned. It was really eye-opening for them and for me. And I'll never forget one kid. He comes in, he walks into my office, and he looks all around, and he says, "Wow, what did you write on your application to get this job?" And it was like, I tried not to laugh, but it was so funny, and the answer that, we talked about in that group, and I would bring up all the time is the best way to become a leader is to learn how to be a good follower. That's the secret. In fact, the Bible doesn't really ever ask us to be a leader. It asks us to be good followers. And what I found in hiring people who were good followers were always the best leaders. People who had been in difficult situations and worked through it were often the best at helping other people in difficult situations. Which then started me thinking about other bosses. And so a lot of ways, this topic of what Paul's talking about is how do you deal as a boss and as a follower. And I remember my second job really out of college, we had a boss that hired, we started to see everybody around us was like devout Christians, and clearly my boss wasn't. I mean, I don't mean that derogatorily, but I mean, he made it very clear that he wasn't a Christian. And so, after a while, we started asking him, "Mike, why are you hiring all Christians? It's very clear that this must be like part of your strategy." And he said, "Well, of course." He said, "You show up every day, you work hard, I can trust you. Why would I hire somebody like me?" So when Paul talks about rewards, sometimes I think he's talking about rewards like that in these difficult situations and in difficult service, we actually do grow and change and learn, and it does show up later. It doesn't always. It's not like a promise that life is going to go well and it's all going to be great, but I do think it's in difficult situations and learning how to serve difficult people and in difficult circumstances, we actually change. So let's go to the final point. Difficult social change. I'm going to read the Ephesians 6:9 again. "Masters, do the same to them and stop your threatening, knowing that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and there's no partiality with him." I don't know if you know this, but there's an election coming up, and it's so hard to ignore it. But basically, the election is about how each side, I'm not going to talk about any side, but each side is going to make so difficult social changes through a political process, right? That's what they all are talking about. And Paul tells us in this short little sentence, I think, something completely different about how social change actually happens and how transformation really happens. It rarely comes through a new law or a political process, it does come through a change of heart and mind. I worked at a large church denomination, and for those of you who are old enough, everybody used to wear a suit to work, and then dress codes changed, and so we were kind of trying to figure all that out, and I remember the head of HR came to me, and she had about, I don't know, a 3 or 4 page document on what she wanted us to implement for dress code. And I started reading this thing thinking, oh my gosh, I mean, rules, rule upon rule. And I thought, this is awful. We're gonna end up with feeling like it's not a great place to work and everything. And so I said, instead of actually doing like all these rules, how about we just say we encourage people to dress for the job you want. I said it's not complicated. If you wanna, and I probably wasn't very charitable here again, some maybe true confessions here. I said, if you want to look like a straight person, and come to work, we can make that happen. But let's not just burden people with a bunch of rules. Let's actually try to change their heart and their mind about what dress means instead of creating a bunch of rules. People rarely change because rules change. People rarely change because the law says that we have to change. And so, I just think what Paul's trying to get at here is something completely different. If we put up the Calvin and Hobbes cartoon again, always go for the head and the heart. That's how social change really happens. It changes when somebody's heart and mind changes about something. It's not because of a new rule. And so Paul is telling them, to the masters, to the people who have slaves, change your heart and mind. Understand that God is your master just like theirs. And if you don't get that in your heart and your mind, you're going to be really sorry. Many historians actually credit the rise of Christianity with basically doing away with slavery in the Western Europe and the Roman Empire. That those two things basically correlated, that as Christianity grew, slavery ended up going away. Today there's research, when I was back at the denomination, it was really interesting. There's a ton of research that when a society starts to have Christ-like attitudes of humility, sacrifice, love of strangers, that it changes society. It only takes about 15 to 20% of the population, and what you see is a society that's marked by corruption and fear and self-serving changes to a society of trust, mercy, and justice. Interestingly enough, those things drive economic health. There are rewards for our role as Christians in helping people to see the life that's truly life, as John Comer is helping us see. Unfortunately, I think it probably works the other way, is if you don't have 15 to 20% of the population with those attitudes, we may be in trouble. So let's wrap up. In 2 sentences, Paul basically, through the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, clearly gives us insight on how to deal with difficult situations, difficult service, difficult people usually, difficult service, and difficult social change. In the Old Testament, there's a story of Joseph. Joseph was, for those of you who don't know it, Joseph was the youngest son. He wore a shirt of many colors, a coat of many colors his dad gave him. So he was the favorite kid, and his brothers decide to sell him into slavery. And he ends up being taken to Egypt to become a slave. And if you've read the story in Genesis, that's the last few chapters in Genesis, Joseph goes through a lot of difficult situations. He's a slave, he's in prison, he's in so many difficult situations. And through that, he is faithful to God, and God is faithful to him through those circumstances. And he ends up basically becoming the second most powerful ruler in Egypt after Pharaoh. He basically saves the whole region because of his administration. There's a famine and basically saves everybody. And the end of the story is his brothers come down. His brothers that sold him into slavery. They come down, and he actually reveals who he is to them. And they were afraid. You know, they are in a situation where he's now the master, and they're in essence the servants. And it's such a great story. And as Joseph reflects on what happens, and by the way, it kind of happens over 2 or 3 times. His brothers keep kind of lying to him, and it's not a great story about the brothers, but it is a great story about Joseph. But there's a ending to that where he said his brothers are there, and he could do whatever he wanted to his brothers, and he says to them, this is in Genesis 50, you intended to harm me, but God intended it all for good. He brought me into this position so that I could save the lives of many people. Isn't that, I mean, sometimes when we're in those difficult situations or difficult circumstances, we don't see what God's doing, and that it may be that in those circumstances, we are there to help them save people. Maybe it's earthly, but at least with our witness for a heavenly purpose. So as followers, whether you're the servant or the boss, just remember, God can use you to change this world.